Welcome to the Skoll World Forum on Social Entrepreneurship, coming to you live from Oxford, England. And today we're talking to a pioneering thought leader. In fact, one of the leading pioneering thought leaders. And also we'll welcome questions from you on Facebook Live. So I'm honoured to introduce Roger Martin, who is director of the Martin Prosperity Institute. And you've written a book, Manual for Good, which is going to be published soon. And it takes a critical as well as a playful look at economic models. You're a former Dean of the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, where you won Dean of the Year award. You've published 11 books, including Getting Beyond Better with Sally Osberg. And you're most widely known, though, as a really truly innovative thinker. And in fact, you've been ranked #1 as a top management thinker in the world by Thinkers 50. Now, you really believe that you need a playful approach to inspire fresh thinking. Can you tell me more?
Yeah, I think when you get really serious, you don't imagine possibilities. And I'm a big Aristotle fan. And what Aristotle, who's known for being a scientist, also said is that when you're trying to create something that does not now exist, you need to imagine possibilities and choose the one for which the most compelling argument can be made. And if you don't take a playful view, I don't think you will imagine possibilities that are at all far from what we see here and now. So I encourage people to be playful and to not shoot down ideas too quickly.
And people might think economics, playfulness, very far ends of the spectrum.
Yes.
And yet you are managing to put them together in your new book. You're really doing some big thinking on economic models. Can you explain more?
Sure. So I'm interested in how we've gotten to a very mechanistic view of how political economies work. It's almost as though we treat the economy like it's a car, and we know that if you press the gas pedal, you'll go faster. If you press the brakes, you'll go more slowly. But I think the economy is more like a forest or a jungle, where you don't really know what will happen when you take a particular action.
So is that any model at all? Is there a model in the jungle?
Well, I think the model in the jungle is that it's adaptive, right? So that it constantly adapts to whatever is happening, and that's just a more kind of, I think, loose model than saying if we do this, we know the results.
So can you give me an example, for example?
Sure.
Give me an example of your jungle model.
Sure.
An example of an economic policy and the sort of way that plays out.
Sure. Well, I think leading up to the global financial crisis in the previous 20 or 30 years, there were lots of new financial instruments created for all sorts of useful purposes, how to hedge risk, credit default swaps, and the like. And they were all had a particular use that the folks designing them said, oh yeah, we can use them for this. But nobody thought that if clever traders who weren't as caring about the global economy would find clever ways to use them to make a buck, that it would actually crash the entire global financial system.
So it was unintended consequences.
Yes.
They weren't intending to crash the system.
Yes, it's like when they took the wolves out of Yellowstone Park 90 years ago because they were killing too many animals. They had no idea what the eventual effect would be. It would change the vegetation patterns. There would be too many elk and they'd be destroying too much vegetation. And they got introduced back into Yellowstone Park, and it totally changed, again, the shape and structure of the park. But nobody was saying, oh, if we take the wolves out of Yellowstone, that it'll have this terrible effect. That's the problem with a complex adaptive system. It's complex, you can't think your way through it up front, and it's adaptive. Whatever situation you present it with or put it in, the players in it will adapt. And I think we need to think about the economy much more as that than a mechanistic thing where the Bank of England will lower the interest rate by X and we'll have Y output. Economists act like they know what's going to happen, but They don't really.
So what can be done then if the economy is like this complex adaptive system where we don't know about unintended consequences which happen in all sorts of different directions? How can economists and how can make policy in such an environment?
You do it like a designer does, right? Which is you try things, little things, you do prototypes, and you watch what happens and tweak and tweak and tweak. So rather than saying we have to have an incredibly long debate about a piece of legislation that we've got to work on to get to be perfect, and then only then, when we got it perfect, will we pass it, and then we put it in as if it's permanent, right? Instead, I'd say we've got to try things and be ready to tweak them and tweak them and tweak them to get them better, rather than striving for perfection out of the box, which in a complex adaptive system is impossible. You will not get perfection out of the box. Don't assume perfection. Assume that you're moving towards better, and you'll have to tweak and tweak.
Because of course in this complex adaptive system there's not just one actor, which is government. There are a host of people who are trying, as you said earlier, to make a buck. So they're trying to game the system but if it continually changes, are you saying that the government can be one step ahead?
I'm not sure so much one step ahead as not definitively 10 steps behind. Right, that's what it is now. So you put in place a piece of legislation that regulates a certain thing like the financial sector, and then you leave it alone. Well, 10 years later or 20 years later, that regulation is guaranteed to be not a step behind, 20 steps behind. And so I'm just saying, have in your toolbox the notion that we'll keep tweaking it. An example in financial regulation from my home country, Canada, is when we created the Bank Act, that is the most important legislation in all of banking. It was put in with an automatic requirement for review every 10 years, which interestingly enough, about 20 years ago was reduced to 5-year intervals. So there was, I think, a very prescient view that the banking industry is going to change, and it has, of course. It changes dramatically, and we need to review in a very holistic way what our legislation is doing. I would rather see more things like that. That is fairly unique. What you have to have is some kind of a crisis, right? Like the global financial crisis, for other banking systems to say, "Oh, I guess we better look at it." And I think it's no accident that no Canadian bank failed or needed a bailout or even got into financial trouble during the global financial crisis.
And this, of course, really matters because we're not just talking about economists and economic models. We're also talking about income distribution and the amount of money that ordinary people have across the world to use and their standard of living.
Yes, absolutely, and this is a big concern of mine, which is that, again, we have a belief, in some sense, in the democratic world, right? That democratic capitalism will produce something that looks more like a normal distribution, like a bell distribution with a big middle.
What do you mean, bell? Sorry.
Yeah, it's a curve that looks like a bell if you look at it, with a big bulge in the middle. So in incomes, it would assume that there are high, or in the middle there's the most number of people with the middle incomes, and then short tails at each end.
So only a very few people who are very poor and a very few who are very wealthy.
Exactly. However, the economy has migrated to a world in which there's coming 80-20 kind of curve, the Pareto Curve, which is named after a famous Italian who figured out 100 years ago that 20% of Italian families owned 80% of the land. So very many people have relatively low incomes, and a few people have exceedingly high incomes. And so what's happened in the economy is we've managed the economy in a way such that we've moved from that world of most people in the middle class doing well, advancing, to a lot of the wealth going to a very few people at the top end. And my concern is that if we want a combination of democracy and capitalism, 51% of people or more have to vote for continuing it. When you had a big middle class where they were doing well, 51% of people or more were happy to do it. Right now, I think you see a bit of a crisis where lots of people are saying, I don't know why it's happening, but I don't like what's happening.
And you've got a little animation to give us a sense of this.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, what I see is a world in which you start out in this normal distribution, and that works for democratic capitalism. And if it migrates to this Pareto distribution, I think it's going to put incredible strains on democratic capitalism. And so you start with that bell curve, you move to a Pareto, and that's because I think we are treating the economy as a machine that we can torque up and torque up and torque up to make go faster, and it's having effects that nobody anticipated.
Thank you very much indeed. I can't see it, but I believe that viewers on Facebook are watching this animation.
Yes.
I've seen it earlier, and it explains it very, very graphically. Yes. So thanks very much. One of the things that I was really interested to read in your book, a rather surprising conclusion, that you said that America's obsession with efficiency is actually slowing it down.
Yes, so the problem with obsessively pursuing more and more efficiency is that what people who study complex adaptive systems like a jungle, like a park, like an economy, when you apply more and more pressure to it, one of the effects that it has is to turn something that is normally distributed into something that's Pareto distributed. So
why would that be? So if you put more pressure, it stops people gathering in the middle and forces people to an extreme? I don't understand.
Yes. Well, essentially, what it does is cause things that work to build up momentum and work more and more and more. So the reason why a distribution is normal is one data point doesn't influence the other. So I don't say to a tall person, you are taller because you stole 4 inches from me. Our heights are independent, and so among men or among women, the heights are normally distributed. Something gets Pareto distributed when effects become the cause of more of that effect.
So give me an example.
Let's take the sister to Facebook, Instagram. How does one choose who to follow on Instagram? Like if you're deciding I'm going to follow some people on Instagram, what do you use to decide who you're going to follow?
Yeah, you might well use how popular they are. That might be a criteria.
Yes, exactly. How many followers they have, and so by that means they get more followers, which means the next time somebody looks at who's got a lot of followers, they do that. So the effect, followers, becomes the cause of still more of that effect. It's like wealth. Having money becomes the cause of earning more money still. So it turns out that when you put more pressure on a system, it tends to have this effect of having effects being the cause of more of the effect, and that gets you the long tail, right? That's why Kim Kardashian can have 130 at last time, 130 million followers, and the average person has about 150 followers. So lots of people with few, and many with more. Now, if we didn't have a system of celebrity that is very intense and people working hard to be celebrities, and if we didn't have perfect communications capabilities, because the other thing that drives things Pareto is lowering cost of connection. So 30 years ago, you wouldn't have known who had the most people who liked them. It would have been fan clubs done by mail. Now, a simple click and you can get it. So the effect of pressure and lowering cost of connection in the global economy is making more things have that accelerating effect.
But we can argue about whether or not it's a good thing that Kim Kardashian has 130 million Facebook followers or Instagram followers, and I might not quite have that number, and along with the vast majority of people. But where does this curve matter?
It matters when it comes to wealth and income, right? So if having income, high income, begets having more high income, having wealth begets having more wealth, and you've got a highly pressurized system that accelerates that, what you get is the income inequality that we currently have. And the income inequality that we currently have is interesting. Income inequality, the difference between a low income person and an average income person, median income person, hasn't changed much. What's changed is the difference between a medium income person and a high income person. The tail of the distribution has gone out farther and farther, and what I worry about is that too much of the economic growth in the economy is going to a very few people, and what that's done is slow down the growth that the average family experiences. And it's quite dramatically how much it's slowed down. And I care deeply about the combination of democracy and capitalism, and so I respect the voters who 51% of whom have to say, we want these people with whatever platform they have running the place. And my view is that we now have a situation where voters are simply saying, I do not like what I see. I'm not sure what I want, but I don't like what I see, and I think Brexit and Trump are perfect examples. Like I'm not going to speak against either Brexit or Trump, but the motivation behind voters was blow it up, right? We have this unease about the EU, so let's blow up UK's participation in it. We're not going to think a whole lot about it. We're just going to blow it up. And in America as well, we don't like the status quo in Washington, so we're going to blow it up.
But you're kind of conflating a lot of different ideas here, because you're conflating frustration with the status quo with the economy as if it's only due to the economic increasing disparities, whereas a lot of analysis of both the election and support of Trump and Brexit in the UK has been a lot more complicated than that.
Oh yeah, I mean, obviously if you wanted to understand American or UK politics, there would be a lot to it, but I think a major contributing factor to the frustration is absolutely real, which is the average family in those two countries, to use those as examples, is experiencing less positive things from the progression of the economy than they used to.
So in the minute that we've got left,
yeah,
what are your solutions?
Well, one, I think policymakers have to think more about tweaking a complex system than striving for perfection. And I think actually citizens have to be more forceful in demanding the kind of environment that they want, and business people have to think more about what is good for the entire ecosystem, not just their company. So I think citizens, policymakers, and business executives all need to make some changes.
Thank you so very much, Roger Martin. That's really fascinating thoughts. And coming up on Facebook Live in 15 minutes here in Oxford, England, we've got Lillian Hill and Alina Kawe interviewed by Michael Painter. Thank you so much for joining us.